All right, welcome everyone to our webinar. We're going to discuss the topic that will affect every trucking fleet or those held under the FMCSA regulations. The webinar titled, Are You Ready? FMCSA Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse Rules Take Effect on January 6, 2020. Simply, the Clearinghouse database will provide access to real-time information, quote, ensuring that drivers committing these violations complete the necessary steps before getting back behind the wheel or performing any other safety sensitive function, unquote. We will do a deep dive into the October registration that's coming up and what 2020 will look like, including what is the FMCSA Clearinghouse, just a quick summary, countdown to the Drug and Alcohol Clearinghouse, what will queries look for, who uses the Clearinghouse, and what will the future look like. I'm Luke Kibbe. I'm going to be your moderator today. Before we get started, just a couple housekeeping items. First of all, we have done many of these webinars now, and many of you are regular attendees. Is there something you'd like to cover in the next couple of months? Please write it down in the chat box. We'd love hearing your ideas. We have another webinar coming up once they post the hours of service changes for the trucking regulations, which we're anticipating July 31st or right around there. So we currently have it scheduled, that webinar topic, on August 16th, I believe, but could be pushed back if those announcements are pushed back. We have another webinar that we're going to be doing at the end of August as well. More information is going to be emailed out. But yeah, we're going to have all the phones muted, so please submit your questions in the chat box. I'll keep an eye on them, and we'll have a Q&A session at the end to answer them. And lastly, you'll receive the presentation and the link of the recording after the webinar. If I can't get it to you by the end of day today, it's the weekend, so expect it in your email box by Monday lunchtime. With that, let's go ahead and get started. I'm excited to introduce CleanFleet's drug testing industry expert and account manager, Lucas Shaw, who's spoken on this subject with the Drug and Alcohol Testing Industry Association, DACA, our own January Safety Conference in Oregon, NATSA Conference, which is for third-party trucking compliance companies, the upcoming Fleet Safety Conference in Vegas, and more. With his help, CleanFleet manages hundreds of drug testing programs and consortium needs nationwide. And so with that, Lucas, welcome and take it away.
Thanks a lot, Luke. Again, thanks you guys for being here. Again, my name is Lucas Shaw, and I'm a project manager here for CleanFleet. I have been talking about this for a lot. It was for a very long time. It was quite literally the first thing that Brian talked to me about when I got hired in 2017. So I have been researching this and talking to federal regulators and talking to people in the industry about this topic for a very long time. So I am getting more and more excited the closer we get to October and then eventually January to see what this is going to be. But recently the FMCSA has been releasing more information and more details about the Clearinghouse, and we're going to share some of those details with you guys here today, as well as just kind of go over some just general overview of what we're looking at here. So first thing being, what is the FMCSA Clearinghouse? So it's a tool. It's for managers to determine whether a prospective driver or the current workforce is eligible to perform safety-sensitive functions. The goal overall is to prevent CDL holders with positive drug and alcohol test results, refusals to take required drug and alcohol tests, those who have not completed a return to duty test, to keep them from job hopping and making it harder to hire these drivers and make the roads safer. So this is primarily based off of a clearinghouse system that is already in play in Arkansas, very similar in the sense that Arkansas collects this information, stores it online, and we've now just taken that Arkansas model national. So what is going to be in the clearinghouse? Essentially, it's going to be all verified positive adulterated or substitute controlled substance tests, all refusals, and this includes failure to appear for like randoms, verified positive EBTs above 0.04, actual knowledge of illicit alcohol or drug use, a negative return to duty, and the completion of a follow-up program. This is going to cover drivers, which means all CDL drivers who operate CMVs on public roads and their employers and service agents. So you can see the list there. If you have to comply with the FMCSA regulations, specifically with the drug and alcohol testing portion, so if you're dealing with vehicles that are over 26K, have more than 15 seat belts, you have to comply with this. So timeline, you can kind of see some dates there. 2016 was when Congress passed the law that gave them the authorization to create this. 2019 is when we're going to start seeing registration. That's going to be in the fall. 2020, that's when we're going to be rolling. January 2020, this law goes into effect. And then 2023, we'll kind of get into what that means a little bit later. So, like I said before, October 2019, that's when the FMCSA expects to have the website active and registration open for drivers, employers, TPAs, MROs, and SAPs. So all carriers need to register on the clearinghouse. I'm assuming that's 99% of the people that are on the phone right now. But again, to be clear, if you have drivers that are covered by 49 CFR of Part 40 and covered by 382, and you have commercial motor vehicles that are over 26K or have 15 seat belts, you need to register on the clearinghouse. There's no exceptions. Carriers that use third-party administrators need to identify the TPA on the clearinghouse. This is another important aspect. If you currently are using a third-party administrator or a consortium to handle your random drug testing and other drug and alcohol testing compliance, you need to tell the FMCSA who that is so that they can continue to perform those services on your behalf. Because there are several reporting aspects here that are going to need to be done by employers or CTPAs that have the permission of employers. Also critical here, all owner-operators need to identify the TPA that's responsible for managing their clearinghouse compliance. We'll get into why that is a little bit later, but that's very important. If you know individuals that have their own authority and are operating, they need to register with the clearinghouse, and they have to identify the TPA that's going to be working on their behalf. Drivers should consider registering. Some important points is that drivers can be notified via email anytime new information is added, revised, or removed. And if they're seeking employment, they're going to have to register. What's critical here is that drivers need to register with the clearinghouse to give permission for employers to see their records. So this is going to be a very large change in the hiring process, because now before you do a pre-employment drug screen, before you do a driver file, you're going to query this clearinghouse to determine if there are records there that would make your prospective employee ineligible. Because now you're not going to have to waste time with all this other stuff. You're going to know right now, is this driver eligible to perform safety sensitive functions? Drivers are also going to have access to their own records for free, and they'll be able to petition to request corrections. As well, any driver that's getting a new CDL is renewing their CDL. They're also going to have to get permission to state driver's license agencies, because they are also going to query the clearinghouse to make sure that a driver is eligible to perform safety sensitive functions. And if a driver does commit a violation, they have to designate a SAP before that SAP can enter information about that driver's eligibility to return to duty. So we had a discussion about this before the presentation. We're not saying that you should have all of your drivers register right now, but drivers might want to consider registering to make the process easier for them going forward. January 6, 2020, this clearinghouse, it is live. Compliance is necessary. Starting on that date, employers are going to be required to report. Again, they're going to be required to report all the things that we've mentioned before. At that point, you're also going to be required to query. Now, some of you may be asking, January 6, 2020, there's not going to be anything in there. Well, that's the point. There's not going to be anything there. But every driver that you query, that's more information that's going to go into the clearinghouse. So starting on that point, every prospective driver that comes in, they've got to be registered with the clearinghouse, because then that's how you get permission to look at their full records. So the federal government then will start to collect that information, and then start to build this clearinghouse out. So we've mentioned full queries, which we'll get into a little bit more detail later, but we're going to start with limited queries. So essentially, a limited query is only seeking if there is new information available on the clearinghouse. So this is primarily going to be used for complying with annual queries, which the FMCSA is requiring that all carriers do on all their drivers at least once a year. Now, I just want to repeat that again. As a carrier, you are going to need to query the clearinghouse at least once a year for your entire fleet of drivers. So if you just have 5 people, you just at least once a year, you need to do a limited query on all 5 of them. You don't necessarily need to do a limited query. You could do a full query, but that requires additional permissions. But a limited query is required at a minimum. And state driver's license agencies will probably be running these when drivers are trying to get new CDLs or renew their CDLs. Now, the detailed query supplies all relevant records to the employer about a driver. You need to do these before letting a driver take a pre-employment drug test. You are also going to need to do these when a limited query tells you that new information is available. So if you use the clearinghouse, you put in driver's information, limited query, hey, I'm just trying to see if there are records here. If the clearinghouse bounces back to you, yes, there are new records here, you need to do a full query to find out what those records are. At this point, then the driver needs to give permission to you via the clearinghouse that you are going to be able to view those records. And they have to do that within 24 hours. So if you have a driver, you do your annual query, something bounces back, they have 24 hours to give you permission. If they don't, you've got to pull them off the road until you can do that detailed query. And again, drivers need to be registered for them to be able to give permission. So what are these queries going to look like? The limited query you can get with blanket consent. And again, it returns whether new records exist, not the actual records. So the blanket consent, in the rulemaking process, the FMCSA was very, very against providing a form for limited queries. Now, as of earlier this week, they are going to provide an example form. But in your new hire paperwork, you probably need to consider some changes that include permissions to do annual queries if they're hired, and then possible changes as well in regards to informing them that they need to be registered with the clearinghouse to get permission for full queries, certain points. Again, if you do that limited query and it replies back that there's information there, you've got to find out what that information is within 24 hours. That consent has to come electronically from a driver. If in 24 hours you can't get permission, you can't view those records, drivers got to be pulled. And once you do that query and once you get those records and you find that there's no violations, at that point, then the driver could return to safety sensitive functions. Again, getting into detailed queries requires the driver's specific consent. So the driver is going to need to log in to the clearinghouse website, and it will see a notification that an employer is trying to seek records, and then that driver must click to give permission for that to happen. The return of records is mainly going to be about violations and eligibility. So violations of regulations, whether the driver has been assessed by a SAP, whether a SAP has cleared the driver to do return to duty, whether the driver has completed a return to duty test, and then whether the driver has completed the follow-up program. If the records identify a violation, then the driver has to be removed from safety sensitive functions, and then the driver must take the appropriate steps necessary to become eligible. So if you have a driver that has a positive test and you don't have any records of a SAP assessment, well, now that driver needs to see a SAP before he can come back. Or if you do this D2A query and it shows you that they have completed a SAP assessment and they are eligible for return to duty test, but there is no return to duty test there, you need to remove the driver and then send them in for a return to duty test. So those are the type of steps when those detailed queries do reveal that there has been a violation by the driver. So who's going to use the clearinghouse? Primarily, it's going to be the medical review officers, SAPs, employers, and third-party administrators. So medical review officers are going to need to report verified, positive, adulterated, or substituted controlled substance test results. Also, refusals to test determined by the MRO in accordance with those regulations. Substance abuse professionals need to report on the eligibility status of drivers with a verified positive test result. Again, this is going to be if the driver has started the return to duty process by seeking an assessment, if the driver has then completed a treatment program and is eligible for a return to duty test. And again, this status will be available to employers when they're running detailed queries. Employers, they're going to have a very large reporting responsibility as well. They're going to have to report alcohol confirmations, refusals based on these different guidelines. Actual knowledge of illicit alcohol or drug use, report negative return to duty test results. That has to be reported by the employer. And then reporting the completion of follow-up programs. Employers are also going to need to include when they report these records, the reason for the test, the driver's name, their date of birth, their CDL number, and state of issuance. This is a really important bullet point here, CDL number and state of issuance. If you currently, as an employer, are not using CDL numbers to identify your drivers, instead of using social security numbers, you need to start changing that now. There is not going to be an option to search for records via social security number. All records are going to be there via CDL number and state of issuance. The federal government doesn't like using social security numbers. They want to use them as little as possible. So they're switching over here to CDL numbers. So you need to start making those changes now to make sure that your records are up to date, that you have current CDL numbers for all your drivers, and as well that going forward, the testing collection sites you use are accurately putting in the CDL numbers of your drivers who submit to tests. I heard earlier this year of some collection sites that completely make up numbers, and that is going to mess everything up if that happens. So make sure that you have a record of CDL numbers. Make sure that you are using those to identify drivers, and that when you send drivers into test, they're using their CDL number and that it is on the CCF. As well, you're going to need to include the employer's name, address, and a new addition now is the US DOT number. So you're going to need to include the DOT number for which this driver is testing under. The date of the test, the date the result was reported, and then again, these are the type of tests employers are going to report. Negative, only on return to duties. Positives or refusals. Third-party administrators are going to be able to perform all the functions that employers do, again, if they're identified by the employers on the clearinghouse. They must report the relevant information for owner-operators, like they have to do that. Owner-operators have to identify a TPA. But for employers with multiple drivers, you need to, when you register on the clearinghouse, identify the third-party administrator that's going to be acting on your behalf to report records. So who's going to actually use the clearinghouse? Primarily, it's going to be 3 people are going to use it to query. The employers, TPAs, and state driver licensing agencies. Employers and TPAs, they're going to need to do a query, detailed query, before a pre-employment drug screen for a prospective driver. They're also going to need to do it annually for all the other drivers to confirm eligibility. Like I mentioned, the annual query, you just have to do one annually. Doesn't necessarily need to be a limited query, but that's the one the FMCSA imagines everyone's going to use. And state driver's license agencies are going to have to use the query the clearinghouse before issuing a new or renewing a CDL license. So what's the future going to look like? So as a driver, you're going to have to utilize the clearinghouse to give permission to employers to view all records available on the clearinghouse. If you refuse to do that, you're prohibited from performing safety-sensitive functions. So you need to make it very clear to drivers that they need to register with the clearinghouse to stay on the road. And if they do not give you permission to view detailed records because maybe they know that they, went and did a drug test for somebody else and they tested positive, you can't use that driver if they don't give you permission, because you are entitled to see what those reports say. They're also going to need to give permission to the state driver's licensing agencies for renewing or getting a new CDL. So if you have drivers that, hey, you see that their CDL is going to expire, they're going to need to register with the clearinghouse because they're probably going to need to give permission to SDLAs. And then if a driver commits a violation, they need to designate a SAP on the clearinghouse so that SAP can enter the information about their eligibility. If you have a situation where a driver has a violation and then they say, yeah, no, I went and saw SAP, and you go on the clearinghouse and there's no record of any SAP, that driver's still ineligible. They can say that they, saw SAP, they completed treatment, all that jazz. If it's not in the clearinghouse, it doesn't count. So drivers need to use this tool for themselves as well if they do commit a violation to help them get back on the road. As an employer, your responsibility is primarily going to be the reporting. You're going to have to report some violations. You're also going to need to query every year, and that's for every single driver. One of the questions during the rulemaking from a carrier was like, well, which carrier is responsible for doing the annual query? The FMCSA is very clear. You have to do one for all your drivers. So if you have a driver that's running for one company and he's running for yours, you still need to query annually. They may do an annual query at a different time than you, but every year you've got to query all your drivers. And that other company has to query all their drivers too. Again, you can run a limited query in lieu of a detailed query. And if that limited query returns anything, you got to do a detailed one. Got to be done within 24 hours. Drivers got to give electronic permission. If they don't, you got to pull them. And once they're cleared, then you can put them back to work. Now, employers may face penalties as well if they're not using this tool properly. There are primarily two concerns. The first is reporting violations late. As it said in the previous slide, as an employer, you have 3 business days to report information to the clearinghouse. So if you have a driver that refuses, let's say, a pre-employment test, they go in, the specimen they provide is out of temp, and then they leave the site. You, as the employer, are the one that has to report that to the clearinghouse. And if you don't do that within 72 hours, maybe that driver a week later goes in, does a pre for another company, and then, hey, they just got hired because you didn't report the refusal in time. So you need to make sure that you're making these, you're reporting this information within 3 business days, and that an investigation of the information may reveal that it may reveal issues if you hadn't reported it on time, and there may be you may be issued fines for violations. There's also a concern about submitting false information, and I know that no employer would ever consider reporting false information, but drivers are still concerned about that. So an employer or a service agent who knowingly submits false information in the clearinghouse may be subject to criminal and civil penalties and will be banned from the clearinghouse. But here's the rub. You still have to report new information and you still have to query. The FMCSA has imagined a system where those carriers who still need to comply with these regulations but aren't able to use the clearinghouse are going to have to report via other ways, which is going to make things so much more difficult. So report information on time to avoid being sanctioned by the FMCSA, and don't report false information, because if you do, you could get kicked off, and then it's going to make your job so much harder. Some of the things you need to change, you need to make sure that you run a detailed query before doing a pre-employment drug test. honestly, before you do a driver file. It should be the first thing you do after an interview with somebody that you like. Like, great, what's your CDL number? I'm going to request information from the clearinghouse. Need you to get permission. Because again, the driver's got to give specific consent. They have to be registered to give said consent. And a driver who refuses, they can't perform safety sensitive functions. Written or electronic consent must be obtained for a driver for limited queries. Again, the FMCSA is going to provide a form maybe, but you can make some changes in your new hire paperwork that make it so that you can, that drivers get permission for those limited queries. You have to keep that consent for up to 3 years. So if a driver is terminated, you have to make sure you keep your limited query consent form for 3 years. And then we get into this 2023 date. Until January 2023, employers are going to need to run a detailed query and comply with Part 40.25, which requires that you contact previous employers. They're imagining that in 2023, the clearinghouse will be enough. So then you're going to have less work in 2023 instead of the additional work that you're going to need to do for the next 3 years or so. So how can CTPAs help? Well, first of all, CTPAs can perform all the duties assigned to an employer, including queries. The employers are going to need to identify on the clearinghouse website if a CTPA is going to be acting on their behalf. Again, we recommend doing this during the registration. It's important to know that CTPAs can't register employers, but we can provide support in navigating the clearinghouse, especially during registration, identifying available information and reporting information related to actual knowledge. An owner or operators have to designate a TPA to report on their behalf. I just want to again stress your consortium and third-party administrator is not going to be able to register for you. You are going to need to do that and then identify the CTPA. So again, there's going to be some initial extra work that's going to need to be done from October to December to be compliant, but that's going to be a really critical juncture where all employers are going to need to register. So, do we have any questions?
And yeah, thank you, Lucas. Feel free to take some time, write down some questions. There's a lot of detail in here. So please, there's no questions currently that we see. So if you have some questions, type it in the chat box right now. Before we wrap it up, and as you guys type up any questions you might have, we just wanted to mention that, you know, especially with the clearinghouse, and if you have a TPA that maybe you don't trust handling your information or dealing with the clearinghouse or other things, or if you're handling your drug program within your own company and want to just pass it along to a good company, CleanFleet's here to help. We help hundreds of companies with our full suite of services, physicals, nationwide, background screening and policy development. As you know, with our blog to all the webinars that we do between Glowstone and CleanFleet, that we're experts in these fields, so we know what we're talking about, and we want to provide that to any employers and any owner-operators as well. Think about switching, use us. One last thing before we jump into questions, I see one that popped up. Wanted to mention on Glowstone's side, we have a new driver app fleet management tool called Permit Book. Basically, it's turning the permit book that's in the cab of every single truck with information on the truck, the trailer, the driver, the company. We're digitizing that, and this app, we've been announcing it for a while now. It is officially as of today, and on Monday it's being switched from staging to going live. So by mid next week, it should be live and ready to go. If you've already joined the wait list, we're gonna talk about that. We're gonna call you, reach out to you, and follow up with you. If you haven't joined the wait list, you can go on there now and already select if you want to sign up for more information. With that, we'll dive back to the questions. Is there a way to print all this information? You are going to receive this presentation, the slides, and the recording that we're doing right now. We're going to email that out hopefully by the end of the day today.
So how long will the search take? Should be instant. Essentially, again, so if you're doing a limited query, it's just seeing if there's records there, if new records have been added. And then when you do the detailed query, then you're just going to see those records. So you should get results, if not instantaneously, very, very quickly. So don't expect this to be something that adds a significant amount of time. Honestly, it should be relatively quick, assuming that everything works right out of the box, which we can't ever say with the federal government. But regardless, we expect it to be relatively quick.
And I'll piggyback on that again. The clearinghouse, as of January 6th, it's not going to pick up any old information. You know, your normal process of the past 3 years of pulling that information will be done. But it's any new positive drug test or anything else that's required to get into the clearinghouse, there's not going to be that much data, at least in the first couple of months anyway, to pull. So realistically. Yeah,
I mean, like if I imagine the first results that are going to come in are from guys that do tests on December 31st. December 31st, they do a test, and then it gets resulted on January 6th. That's when I imagine the very first results are going to be. Is the FMCSA going to provide more information by the end of the year? Yes, they will. Again, they provided a new facts sheet this week with some updated information. So I would anticipate there being much more information as we get closer. I imagine that there's going to be a full court press once we get to October, and probably a little bit before, because we still don't know necessarily what it looks like. But we're getting more information day by day.
And so if you haven't yet, if you type in just to Google FMCSA Clearinghouse, go to the official FMCSA Clearinghouse website. You can sign up for an email anytime they update information. They'll email blast everybody that signs up there. Otherwise, join our newsletter at CleanFleet.org. There should be a button somewhere there to join our newsletter. We do a monthly one. If there's any interesting information that pops up immediately, we can send that out quickly. And if you're interested in more future webinars, again, join the newsletter there, and we'll keep you updated as well. With that, is there any other questions that popped up? I don't see any as of yet. Thank you all for joining us. Definitely one of our biggest webinars to date, so it's been fun. Again, expect an email out, if not by end of day today, on Monday by lunchtime, and we will have the recording of this and the slides of this presentation emailed out to everybody that registered, whether they showed up or not. So expect that in your inbox shortly. With that, no other questions. We're going to wrap it up. Thank you, Lucas Shaw, for the presentation, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great weekend.